Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey? On Christmas night in 1996, the brutal murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey shocked the nation. Found dead in her family's Boulder, Colorado home, JonBenét's body was discovered in the basement with a broken skull, strangled by a garrote, and sexually assaulted. A ransom note left in the home added to the confusion, but the truth would prove even more elusive. As the case unfolded, the media swarmed and speculation ran rampant. JonBenét's status as a child beauty queen only fueled the fire, with many focusing on her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, as the primary suspects. However, the case took an unexpected turn when the Boulder District Attorney's office brought in legendary homicide detective Lou Smit. Already known for bringing to justice the killers of actor Kelsey Grammer's sister, Karen, Lou was a good choice. Unfortunately, Smit, known for his unyielding pursuit of the truth, quickly grew disillusioned with the Boulder police's focus on the Ramsey family. He believed that vital evidence pointing away from the parents was being ignored. Resigning from his official role, Smit chose to continue his investigation privately, using his own resources, determined to find justice for JonBenet. In his book, Lou and JonBenet, Smit's longtime friend and colleague, John Anderson, reveals the story behind Smit's tireless investigation and the profound legacy he left behind. Drawing on Smit's extensive work, Anderson and the detective's family and colleagues believe the elusive killer can finally be identified, bringing justice to a case that has haunted the nation for nearly 3 decades. It is my pleasure to welcome John Anderson to this edition of Murder Most Foul. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So, as I pointed out, this is a memoir because the Lou in this story is Lou Smit, who was a police officer, a detective, many hats over many years. And you, I don't know, you'll explain this. I don't know if you're technically partners, but you knew him and worked with him and this was Boulder, Colorado, correct?
We were both
not
police
over all the
officers
time, but
in Colorado Springs, about an hour and a half south of Boulder. And Lou was about 20 years older than me, so he was kind of a senior mentor when I came on the police department. I was right out of high school, and he was already a detective. And when I became a police officer, when I turned 21, one of my dreams was to become a homicide detective, work with Lou, and I got to have that experience for 6 years. We were homicide partners. And then he retired, went to the district attorney's office, coroner's office, and I ran for sheriff of our county, El Paso County, Colorado, was elected. And I told Lou we had an unsolved murder in the unincorporated area of El Paso County, Heathered on Church, to drop a name. And I told Lou, I said, one of the reasons I'm running for sheriff is I'm concerned that killer may still be in our community and active. And he was. Lou agreed to come into the sheriff's office if I was elected, take over that investigation, and became my captain of detectives. And the photo that I put on the cover of the book is Lou on our first day in office together, January 10th, 1995, when he took over the Heather Dawn Church case. Within 3.5 months, he solved the case. It was Heather was 13 when she was abducted in 1990, kidnapped out of her home. There was no body. And 2 years later, to the day, her body was found in a remote area, mountainous area in Colorado. And she was positively identified through forensic odontology, teeth impressions. 2 years later, 1994, the case is still unsolved. And I had thought about retiring early and running for sheriff. I had an uncle who was the sheriff of El Paso County. And I thought, well, when I'm an old gray guy, it might be a good retirement job. Only this case, this cold case, the Heather Dawn Church, wouldn't go away. And so when Lou took over the investigation, it was really Lou working with the same evidence that was there all along. And when he arrested this guy, the killer, Robert Brown, Browne, he lived just right down the street from him, and he had been involved in a number of other murders. In fact, he later confesses to Lou and Lou's cold case squad. Once he's in custody in Department of Corrections, he starts a letter writing campaign with one of my detectives. He ends up confessing to 49 murders. Now, if you can believe them, we were able to confirm 6 for sure and convict him of one of those. I think, and Lou thought that 49 was probably a good number in the Western U.S. And if so, it would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. I mentioned that up front, Jim, because there's a lot of similarities between Heather Dawn Church and JonBenet. You know, the focus on the parents, false information about the crime scene, detectives overlooking the value of the physical evidence. In the JonBenet case, it's the DNA. But Lou, to finish out our story together, and the reason why I spent so much time in part 1 of the book was to really give Lou the credibility that he deserved, because he knew homicide investigations from medical legal, from the forensic pathology, from the crime scene, from being in charge as a captain of detectives or a major law enforcement agency, and he had worked over 200 homicide cases, had a perfect a 98% clearance rate, but a perfect 100% conviction rate. So he really had no equals, to include myself. The detective friends that we had who knew Lou and worked with him like I had said, if we really worked hard and did our very best, if we could get to be half as good as Lou, then we will have accomplished something special in our lives. And that was so true with Lou. So he had retired from the sheriff's office. His wife, Barb, had cancer and was in remission when the JonBenét Ramsey murder happened. And so the DA in Boulder, Alex Hunter, the original first DA over the case, he called me and he said, I'm putting together this task force on the JonBenét Ramsey case. Would you recommend Lou Smit be a part of that? And I said, oh, absolutely. I said, that'd be the best decision you could make. It was the best decision I made as an elected official. And I said, just do what I did. I put Lou in charge of the case. I said, you have unlimited resources. If you need more budget and more personnel, just ask. I said, that'll be my job to raise the money. I said, I'll commit my first term if we need to catching this killer. And if I get a second term, then we'll commit that one too. So Lou, when he went to work on the JonBenet case, one of the problems was he was not put in charge of the investigation. He was with the DA's office, not the police department, so he didn't have firsthand access to the evidence like he did when he was working with Colorado Springs Police Department or for me at the sheriff's office. And so everything he got had to be filtered through the police department, the detectives. And he had a wonderful reputation throughout Colorado. So when he was first selected, the Boulder police, welcomed him in as part of their investigative team, until Lou started pointing at some of the other evidence that suggested perhaps someone other than the Ramseys might be who we should be looking at. The broken window in the basement, the foreign physical evidence that we'll talk about here in a minute. But the more Lou talked about the possibility of intruder, the more he became ostracized by the Boulder police. And I think the DA, Alex Hunter, was kind of still intrigued with Lou, but the political forces in Colorado kind of took over. The governor demanded something happen and assigned 3 special prosecutors out of the Denver metro area to kind of take over a grand jury. And Lou saw this was going to be a train wreck. He knew the only reason they were putting this grand jury together was to indict these parents for a murder that they didn't commit. And so in protest, Lou resigned from the DA's office. He kept copies of his investigative reports, and Lou always used his own computer. And so the DA actually carried his hard drive to Lou's car, and he knew he was taking copies of the autopsy, copy of crime scene photos. And included in there, Jim, was a copy of a DNA report that excluded the family. So we can talk about that here in a little bit too. But Lou was aware of the physical evidence probably more than anybody was, but he could understand and he could appreciate, the value of that evidence. And so he is probably the only reason that Ramsey, the parents, were not arrested for this case, because Lou fought to appear before the grand jury. The parents were indicted on a misdemeanor child abuse of some charge, but the DA, when he got the true bill on those indictments, he looked at that and he thought, there's no way we can convict these parents of this crime, and so no charges were ever put forward. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about some of the physical evidence in a little bit, but I don't want to get ahead of you. So please,
John, the question I want to ask, I should have probably asked at the beginning of this interview, but it's signed from a wonderful memoir of Lou Smit. What was your impetus to write? Why did you think after all these years there need to be more coverage of the JonBenet Ramsey case?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Part of that is the public interest. And it's fascinating, Jim, when I go out and do talks at our author book signings, and I've probably done 12 or 15 since I launched the book 2.5, 3 years ago. And then I've appeared probably on 8 or 10 podcasts similar to this one. And when I do a live talk, it's now become a practice of mine that at the beginning, I like to ask a show of hands. How many people think it was a family member? And usually it's 75 to 80, 85% of the people, the hands go up. And then I say, well, how many think it was the mother? And, probably the majority of those, how many think it was the father? And then you'll see it, some go up and hands go up. And I say, well, how many think it was the 9-year-old brother, Burke? And you'll see people raise their hands. And usually about that point, I say, well, what's interesting is there's only been one person that the Boulder Police Department have ever officially eliminated as a person of interest, and that was Burke. But that word really has not filtered out. But probably less than 10% of the people, when I do these informal polls, believe that it was an intruder. But once they hear the physical evidence and they get the facts of the case, not what they had heard or read from the tabloids or the misinformation, or in fact in some cases misinformation that was deliberately put out there by the police or someone. When they hear the facts and you go through the case like Lou did, like he presented it, then with very few exceptions, probably I do a poll at the end of my talk, which usually is about an hour long. And I ask, well, how many now believe it was the mother? Very few hands, almost none, almost nobody, the father. Once in a while, you might get somebody that, thinks it's still the brother. That's rare. But probably 90% of the people, believe that it is an intruder. And I think it's hard for some people, once police officers included, once you kind of, get blinders on and you think it's this person, that's so hard to open your mind up to look at other evidence. And one of the theories that I talk about in the book that comes into play here. It's actually one that I borrowed from Sherlock Holmes, and the theory says, do not allow the theories to dictate the facts, allow the facts to dictate the theories. So when someone comes into the investigation or into the discussion or to a talk, and their theory is, well, Burke did it or Patsy did it, and that's their mentality. That's their theory. And when you bring in a piece of factual evidence, physical evidence, and you say, okay, here's the Colorado Bureau of Investigation CBI lab report on the DNA, and it has John Ramsey's name, Patsy's name, Burke's name, John Andrew, the whole Ramsey family, plus other people, the housekeeper and a few others. When you show them that document that excludes all the members of the Ramsey family who had submitted their DNA or hair or handwriting, and it says, so this lab report was dated 3 weeks after the murder, January 15th of 97 is when it's dated. And Jim, what I'll do when we finish this interview, I'll email that to you. And if you want to, you can post that. It's just 2 pages, but people can actually see that. But there are some people who will look at that physical evidence, that lab report, and because it doesn't fit the theory, they'll just, oh, well, that doesn't explain, that Patsy wrote the note and it was a cover up. And then when you give them evidence, as I pointed out in the book, that Lou had found, that other forensic experts came forward and said, there's problems with the note and a forensic comparison on the writing instrument. And then one expert came out, who's probably the most experienced expert, a retired Secret Service agent, who looked at the note and said, Patsy didn't write this note, he didn't author it. But one of the challenges just on the note, before I forget, was the note was so unusual. It was 2.5 pages.
It was bizarre. And it's by the way, ladies and gentlemen, it's in the book, the picture of the note. And so other books I've seen where you've got it's a tiny, but you can see the entire note in the book. And please carry on. It is a bizarre note.
In my book, I got permission from Lou's family to publish, I think in my book, there's 36 photos, crime scene photos and photos on the note, and some of the other things we're going to talk about, the garrote that was used to kill her and the parachute cord that was used to bind her hands. If you go on to my website, I'm not my website. Well, I have a website, jwander.com, jwander.com, and there's some information there. But my publisher for the book, wildbluepress.com. Wild Blue Press did an extraordinary job.
They're great. They're great. They're great.
They were really committed to this.
They are fantastic.
Yeah, and one of the co-owners, Steve Jackson, had met Lou prior to 2010. And when this was after Lou had left the DA's office and was trying to get people's attention that, hey, the Ramseys didn't do this. There's evidence of an intruder. Tragically, he had cancer once before, prostate cancer, and beat it. And he was in remission. And this was after Barb, Lou's wife, had passed away. And then Lou was struck with cancer again. But before he went into hospice in 2010, one of the co-owners of Wild Blue Press, Steve Jackson is his name, who is also a true crime author. And so he met with Lou and talked about the case, and he wanted to do a book on the JonBenet Ramsey case, but he was just finishing another book project. And he told Lou, well, I'll get back to you. Let me finish this other project. And unfortunately, when he got back to Lou had already passed away. And so when I was looking for an author for this one, another friend of mine who is an author said, you need to talk to the guys over at Wild Blue Press. Steve Jackson's wanted to do a JonBenet book for the last 10, 12 years, however long it'd been since Lou had passed away. And so when I put in the query to Wild Blue Press, Steve Jackson saw that and he called almost immediately and he said, John, we're going to publish your book. He said, I felt so bad that I didn't do Lou's book when he was with us. And then I I waited too long. And he said, this is that opportunity to make up.
One of the things that I find tragic about this case, and it's not among most of them. First of all, it's quote unquote, it's cold because we don't have the killer. But so it's bad enough I have a daughter. I can't imagine losing her in any way, but losing her to something so horrific, what her final minutes, her final hours were like, and then to be blamed for it, not just by the police. They're always going to start with the family and then you work your way out. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But for years, and to be vilified on programs and documentaries and billboards and People magazine, and poor Patsy dying, and in that still quote unquote being a suspect, if not by the police, by the public.
Right.
That's hard to get my mind around. But
you're so right, Jim. And a couple of years after the murder, Lou called me, and he'd already left the DA's office. He was already working the case on his own. He wasn't working for the Ramsey family. He wasn't being paid. He was doing this all on his own expense. John Ramsey said he even tried to buy Lou an ice cream cone once, and Lou refused it because he didn't want anybody to ever think he was doing this. Lou always said, I'm working for JonBenet, and that's really what he believed, in seeking justice for JonBenet. But Lou had called me a couple of years after he left the DA's office in Boulder, and he said, hey, John, I want you to come meet John and Patsy Ramsey. They're going to be in town. And he said, I really want you to meet them. Now, I didn't really know why. I was still the sheriff of El Paso County, and of course, we have mutual aid. We'd render assistance to any law enforcement agency, but Boulder PD was at the time, and still is, resistant on, accepting help from any outside agency. And so I got to meet Patsy and John together with Lou. Unimaginable grief what the family was going through. But the things that really stood out to me is what a wonderful couple, very accomplished, very loving couple, and certainly not the kind of people who would be involved in the murder of a daughter, either one. And they would say this: I would have given my life for JonBenet, and you can that's genuine. That's not a made up story. Patsy passed away probably within a year and a half later. So that was the one and only time that I got to meet her. But I've stayed, and so has our Smit family team, stayed in touch with John Ramsey for the last 28 years. In fact, our team just met with John Ramsey, his now wife, Jan, and John Andrew, the older half-brother of JonBenet, last Saturday. We had breakfast. They came in for a meeting that our team meets every month or two. We used to meet monthly. Now it's every 6 or 8 weeks or as needed. But we've been together since Lou passed away in 2010, trying to continue to finish his work. And every so often we will meet with the Ramsey family. I don't know if we meet every year, but we stay in touch with them very frequently. And have since then. John Ramsey is 80 or 81 now, but he is still mentally just as sharp, as can be. He has gone through a lot of the emotional grief that any of us would, as a father. I have 3 daughters myself, and I think the pain that he has gone through is unimaginable, but I think what's really helped him and helped Patsy was their strong religious convictions. And so he speaks openly, about the loss. He 2 years ago appeared with another journalist, a friend of Lou's, Paula Woodward, at CrimeCon in Las Vegas, and I flew to Vegas just to be there to support their program. He, by the way, and with Paula, is going to be at CrimeCon 25, which is in Denver in September. So we're all planning, our team is planning on being there to support John, and he's again speaking with Paula Woodward. And it's interesting, when they start the interview, you can just tell there's a lot of real animosity towards John, almost hatred. And then once he starts talking about the case, and Paula Woodward, who does a wonderful job as a journalist, similar to what you're doing, asking the right question at the right time and drawing out the answers. And she's written 2 books on the Ramsey investigation. And by the time you get to the Q&A session after the first 50 minutes or so, the crowd is completely turned. I've seen them speak to as many as 3,000 people, more than 3,000 at a time in a large auditorium. And by the end, and again, there's still maybe 10% or less who are just hardcore that no, Patsy did it, it was an accident or whatever. But the majority of people walk away that have actually heard him and met him and seen him and listened to him with the understanding that, this is a grieving father. This isn't a sexual pedophile. And that's part of the other problem, Jim, is that people really were given misinformation about physical evidence from the beginning, and they've never really heard, what the evidence that to include the sexual assault. So let me turn the questions back over to you to see where you'd like to go from here. It's your interview.
Yes. So let's go through the loss or the missing child, the discovery of the child, by whom it was discovered, the people who show up, and then we can go through certainly as Lou goes through it, the real evidence.
The date was December 26th, 1996, the morning after Christmas. The Ramsey family had a wonderful Christmas. JonBenet got a new bicycle, and Burke is there. The parents, a lot of this is captured on home movies or still shots, and not a mark on JonBenet on her body, and that becomes important. The kids play with their toys through the day, and then that evening, late afternoon, evening, the Ramseys, along with their 2 children, go to a friend's house. The friends invited them to dinner, and they have children about the same age as Burke, and the 9-year-old, and JonBenet, who's 6 at the time. So the family's outside the home. There's nobody in the home. It's interesting to note, too, that JonBenet had a little white dog by the name of Jock. And Jock is on the front cover of my book here at JonBenet's Feet. That little dog slept with JonBenet all the time. It was her dog. This photo, by the way, was sent to me by JonBenet's father. When I was writing the book, I was very specific with the publisher that I wanted the photo of Lou and JonBenet on the front side by side. And I had another photo of JonBenet. And so when I sent the mock-up of the book cover to John Ramsey, he sent me a nice note, email back, and he said, "Oh, that's one of my favorite photos. It's really nice. I appreciate that, what you're doing." But he said, "I like this photo better." He said, "It's a picture that Patsy took the first day of kindergarten for JonBenet, and she had her dressed up in this cute little dress, and she's got her backpack slung over her shoulder and a little plastic apple. I don't know what's in there, a treat for the teacher or the other kids." But that becomes really important because it's one of the few photos that shows Jock. And so the little dog was not at home that evening because the Ramseys were leaving early the next morning, and they were flying to their vacation home up in Michigan. And so John had taken the dog across the street to one of the neighbors who was going to watch Jock, and done that before. Had Jock been there and had been sleeping with JonBenet, little dogs like to yap and carry on, there's a good chance that the intruder may have been alerted. I've always wondered, did somebody who knew that Jock wasn't there, did they plan the murder around that time? So Jock becomes really important. So when the Ramsey family gets home, about 10 o'clock on the night of the 25th, the kids are exhausted. John carries little JonBenet up and puts her into her bed, and not to wake her up, he doesn't put on her pajamas. He just kind of gets her ready for bed. So the clothing that she's worn most of the day, to include the little shirt that she's got on and the long johns that she had and the panties, that's pretty much what she had on that day. So he covers her up. She goes to sleep. Burke is on we'll talk about the crime scene here in a little bit, but Burke sleeps on the same level. John and Patsy sleep in the level above them. That used to be an attic that they've converted into, remodeled into a master bedroom suite. So they're in the floor above. Then below John or below JonBenet and Burke's second floor is the main level. That's where the front entrance, the kitchen, there's a spiral staircase that connects the floors. That becomes important because the lower step of the main living area is where the 2.5-page ransom note is found by Patsy. So there's an attached 2-car garage that's accessible from the back alley. And then there's a basement or a sub-basement. It's an older home. It's been added onto several times. So the original house, over 100 years old, very nice area in Boulder called University Hill. A lot of the college professors lived there. That's how it got its name. And that's where JonBenet's body is found, is in the sub-basement in a room that they referred to, the Ramseys, as the wine cellar. Don't know why. There was not one bottle of wine in there. The Ramseys really weren't drinkers, but they called it a wine cellar. I guess it was just nice to have one. So everybody's asleep shortly after or before midnight on Christmas night. So 5 o'clock in the morning, the parents wake up. Patsy starts down the winding staircase to go make coffee. John is upstairs. He's starting to get dressed in the master bedroom. There's a his and her bathroom. So he's there when he hears this scream. And so he comes running downstairs. Patsy, as she's coming down the winding staircase, the last step, she looks down, sees 3 pieces of paper that weren't there before. And so she picks those up and says, well, what's this? And she's early in the first line or 2 paragraph says, we have your daughter. And so she realizes this is something horrific. So she screams that John hears. She races upstairs, opens the door into JonBenet's bedroom. He's not there. She's not there. So John comes down. They check. Burke is still in his bedroom, still asleep. And so as soon as John Ramsey sees the note, the kidnap note, demanding a ransom of $118,000, and we can talk about the amount here in a minute. But he tells Patsy, he says, call 911, call the police. And so she does. And so almost immediately, she's on the phone with the 911 operator at the Boulder Police Department, and you can hear the panic in her voice. Now, other people will listen to that and say, oh, well, you can listen to her and, this is just an act, she's, a normal parent wouldn't do this, or she's not acting like a normal parent. Well, John brings up the question later that's so valid. He says, well, what's normal? How are you supposed to act when you find your child missing? And anyone who's missed any parent who's missed their child, even for a few seconds in a department store or a park, and you look around and say, well, where's so-and-so? You get that panic, and nobody can predict, what you're going to act like, sound like, and what you're going to do next. It's just sheer panic that takes over. And so a lot of what happens that morning, or the police, making inferences. It's also interesting that almost none of the early police officers that arrive, or detectives, are married or have any kids. And so later, Lou brought this up. Well, it makes you wonder, how they came up with this without any personal references. An example is one of the detectives came up with a theory that Patsy accidentally killed JonBenet after a bedwetting incident. And what Patsy said later was, she says, I've survived stage 4 ovarian cancer. She says, believe me, bedwetting is not a big deal. And that's a very convincing statement. But I think most parents, you just deal with a bedwetting incident. It's not something you're going to have a fit of rage to the point that you're going to kill your child, but purposely or accidentally. That's also an interesting part of the physical evidence. Now, we had talked about Occam's razor theory, what is most obvious is most often correct. And in this case, I'm getting a little bit down a rabbit hole, Jim, so you'll have to bring me out of it after I make this point. But it's a valid point.
I'll bring you out.
It's quintessential Lou Smit, detective. Not only did he know forensic evidence in different aspects of the forensic sciences, but he also knew the importance of crime scene reconstruction in interpreting harmful events. So one of the issue with this bedwetting incident is that JonBenet, her panties, her underwear that she's wearing, is urine stained. So she did wet her pants, her underwear. But her bed's not. There's no urine stain on the sheets. So when Lou points this out to the detectives, the homicide detectives in Boulder, one of them comes up with the theory that, well, the parents washed the sheets after they accidentally killed JonBenet. Well, that makes almost no sense. Well, what they're doing is they're trying to force the physical evidence to fit this theory about the facts, and now they're turning the facts around and then pulling another just unimaginable thing that, well, anybody who's washed sheets of a child's bed and then made the bed, and then the theory was, well, Lou pointed out in the crime scene photos, well, you could tell somebody slept in that bed. It's messed up. Well, when they made the bed, they roughed it back up again to make it look like somebody had been sleeping there. It was kind of like, are you listening to yourself? And
these parents are so diabolical.
Yeah, and here's the sad reality: nobody in the Boulder Police Department, from the homicide detectives that were assigned their first case, nobody up through all the way up through the chain of command, none of them had ever worked a murder before. None of them. Boulder is a small college town northwest of Denver where there are a lot of murders. Boulder has since had several tragically murders, but this was a small college town, and most detectives might have worked, stolen bicycles or something, but violent crime was not something that they experienced very often. And that's good if you live there as a resident. It's bad if you're the victim of a violent crime and you're expecting them to crack the case. Well, the tragedy is that homicide detectives from the Denver Police Department, two experienced homicide detectives, were offered from the Denver Police Department to work the JonBenet murder in Boulder for free. They were going to cover their salaries for as long as it takes. Boulder Police command staff said, no, we got this. We don't need your help. It's okay. We got it. Go away. The FBI was allowed to do the phone trace. Again, there's a ransom note. In the ransom note, the killer leaves the message, I will call you tomorrow at 10 to give you instructions on, and don't go to the police, don't try to grow a brain. And so it's a really bizarre note. The problem that John Ramsey has is when he reads the note, it's 5:30 in the morning. And so is 10 o'clock tomorrow, is that 10 o'clock that day, the 26th of December, or is it the next day, the 27th? When was the note written? So the first police officer who arrives at the Ramsey house after the 911 call, it only takes them 3 minutes to arrive on scene. So that's extraordinary at 5:26 in the morning, almost unheard of to have a 3-minute response time. So the first uniformed police officer in Boulder PD ringing the doorbell at the Ramsey's house. The door opens, and Patsy, as she said on the 911 call that's recorded, says, "We have a kidnapping. My daughter's missing. Here's the ransom note I found on the steps." He takes the note and he reads it, and he hands it back to her. Well, it hasn't even gone through the house yet. So that's the beginning of the problems that are contributed to. So when The next detective or police officer or sergeant, whoever shows up, they want to read the note, and they give it back to the dad. The dad, the neighbors come over. The priest, there's even a priest that comes over to pray. And everybody who walks in there, we think that there may be as many as 28 people handle the note. Finally, one detective by the name of Linda Arndt, she takes possession of the note. She later makes copies so people can pass around the copies. But by then, the DNA, the touch DNA, the fingerprints, whatever is on there has been completely destroyed, if there were any. The suspect could have been wearing gloves. We'll never know. I make that statement because there's very few fingerprints that are found in the house. There is one unidentified palm print on the in the basement on the inside of the door to this wine cellar where JonBenet's body's drugged to and left. So that's never been identified. Could belong to the killer, could belong to movers, from 3 years back. We don't know. There's also a well-documented set of fingerprints that's found on a bowl in the kitchen that had pineapple in it, and those fingerprints belong to Patsy. And so what some naysayers to the intruder theory, how they'll interpret that is, Patsy, she handled the bowl that had the pineapple, and the pineapple is found in JonBenet's stomach. But this is Patsy's home. How do we know she's not the one that took the bowl out of the dishwasher and put it away? I would expect that you'd find her fingerprints all over the house. So again, when you get a piece of physical evidence like a fingerprint, and now you distort that to try to fit your evidence to fit that suspect who you have in your mind committed this crime, the mother did it, then that's very problematic, to say the least. Back to the sequence of events, the officer, he's joined by other patrol officers. A sergeant shows up. They call a crime scene CSI team, lab team out of Boulder PD who show up, and they do start taking photographs inside and outside. Well, two of the misstatements that are made early one is that there is no footprints in the snow, and people our age, I'm probably a little older than you, Jim, but I remember when this case happened, and you're seeing on national news the front of the Ramsey house. There's snow. It's Christmas time, and there's ornamental candy canes lining the sidewalk going up the house. And there is snow in the front of the house. There's snow on the north side. There's snow on the west side where the family comes in from the alley to pull into the attached two-car garage. But on the south side of the house, Lou shows the crime scene photos taken by the Boulder Crime Lab early that morning, just right after the sun came up on the south side of the house, that there's no snow. Well, those of us that have lived in Colorado or many other states in the U.S., North America, the southern facing part of the house is the warmest part of the house. And this area was even a little more secluded, where Lou believes the point of entry was made by the killer or killers. He always left the possibility open that there might be two, that maybe it's not just one. But so what happens is Boulder police search the house. They can't find JonBenet. They don't know what's happened. They do have the note, but almost immediately they start suspecting the family. So again, when you get a piece of information or misinformation, no footprints in the snow, then that kind of reinforces your thoughts that the parents did it. The second misinformation that came out that formed people's opinions early on was that there's no forced entry into the house. Well, Lou went. He was hired by the Boulder DA the first part of March. So the case was about 3 months cold when he finally had access to the crime scene. And when he went to Boulder, he really kind of went under the opinion, like most everybody in America did, or around the world, that somebody in the family is responsible for the murder. It's just a matter of sifting through the evidence and figuring out which one. But when he got there and he realized that that the information, no forced entry into the home, was false. He pointed this out to the detectives, and in the basement, sub-basement, leading from the south side of the home through a window well that had a heavy metal grate. If you went into that window well, you'd find that there was one pane of the window had been broken that's closest to the lock. And how that window pane got broken was the previous summer by the father, John Ramsey, who locked himself out of the house. And so to gain entrance, he lifts the grate, crawls into the window well, breaks the glass, reaches in, unlocks it, lets himself in, closes the window. But he said, John, he said, that's one of my biggest regrets, is that I never had that window pane repaired. I should have done it. It just, kind of slipped my mind. And so John Ramsey let himself in through that window. Lou pointed to the crime scene photos taken by the Boulder Police crime scene lab, the CSI lab, and they had the early photos that showed this window standing wide open. And then down below the window was a suitcase that had been put up on end. And then Lou pointed out on the crime scene photos where there was a scuff mark, about a 6 or 8 inch scuff mark that was below the window and above the suitcase. Well, the window in the window well in a sub-basement, this one anyway, was probably up about 4.5, 5 feet. So it was a little hard to get in there. And what Lou found was it was easier if you positioned a suitcase or something to step on to let yourself get out of that window. So Lou was convinced that this had to be the point of entry and probably the point of exit of the killer or killers. When he pointed their crime scene photo to the Boulder Police Department out to the detectives and said, well, this window was standing wide open. Not only that, the dad, when he first sees the window, he turns to a friend and he says, that's the window that I got in when I got locked out last summer. And he said, that suitcase there, that's our suitcase, but that's not where we keep the suitcases. Somebody's moved that suitcase over there. So back to the sequence of events and how John ends up in the basement. This is 5.5 hours after the police arrive. So what had happened was the police search the Ramsey home inside and out, don't find her, don't find much significant physical evidence in their mind. Some, again, believe there's no footprints in the snow, there's no forced entry. Some of that may be being passed on verbally from one uniform officer to a detective to somebody else. That may also have been passed on to members of the media because they're, the reporters are just coming in flocking in from all over, not only North America, but internationally, the Associated Press. So the media in paparazzi, they're just searching for information to the point that they're buying information from people, to include one Boulder area police officer that they bribed, that they paid to give them information and photos. It was not, to their credit, was not a Boulder police detective or an officer. It was somebody beyond the Boulder Police Department, peace officer, who accepted that bribe. They even bribed the lab who was processing the film. At the time, it was before digital photography. So the media was falling all over themselves for any scrap of information, and Boulder police don't make any official statements to the media, hold a press release until several days later. So the media's buying, scrambling for information. There's a vacuum. And I think one of the lessons learned out of this, Jim, is for law enforcement agencies is to, the quote that I remember from my training is, if you don't control the media will control you. After the initial police are there, they photograph the crime scene, they search, they can't find JonBenet. In looking at the ransom notes that they're going to call at 10, they decide to leave they do put a phone trap on the phone line, the Ramsey. This is when we had a home phone, and the Ramseys the FBI puts a phone trap on their home phone. You can do that without being in the home. The FBI was never allowed in the house ever. They were not allowed to be inside, even though they offered, whatever resources they could bring to bear. But Boulder PD, again, is of the mindset, we've got this covered. We know what we're doing. Go away. We'll take care of it. We understand this. So all of the marked police cars are moved. Everybody's waiting for that 10 o'clock hour. One of the things that happens during that time is a lone detective by the name of Linda Arndt is left in the crime scene in the Ramsey home with the family. And the priest is there. There's family members. There's neighbors. People who mean well come over. So as the family and the detective Linda Arndt are waiting for the 10 o'clock hour to come, that's when the ransom note said that's when they would call the kidnapper. Linda Arndt tells John Ramsey, I want you to search the house again. She later says, just to give you something to do. And search the whole house, take somebody with you, and see if you can find anything out of order. So when John Ramsey, shortly before 10, is in the basement again with his friend, he opens the door of the boiler room, and then he opens the wine cellar door, and he sees JonBenet on the floor. And being a father, you can imagine, the horror and the grief, and he screams, and he reaches down, and there's black duct tape over her mouth, and he rips that off, trying to help her breathe. He's doing everything he can. He tries to untie the parachute cord that's around her wrist. It was tied so tight he couldn't do that, but he's trying to help his little girl. He finally picks her up in his arms, like any of us would do, and screams and runs upstairs with JonBenet and lays her in the living room where the detective was at, and gets down on her hands and knees. John's right across from her. They're just inches away. Their faces are just inches away over this dead little girl. And she says she looks up from the body. She declares JonBenet dead. And she looks up across the body into the eyes of the killer. She said, when I looked into John Ramsey's eyes, I knew I was looking into the eyes of the killer. And I immediately started counting the number of bullets in my gun. Well, to me, that is evidence of somebody who's very inexperienced. Again, as a police officer for over 30 years, I knew how many bullets were in every gun I ever carried. And you knew that, without counting them. So I don't know what she thinks that she's alluding that she's concerned that John Ramsey's going to kill every one of them. She didn't think that when, the other police officers arrived, there'd be anybody else alive, that they'd all be dead. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the physical evidence that's left on the body, to include the cordage that's tied around her wrists. Very unusual cordage. It's paracord 550. It's white. And if you're not familiar with paracord, I wasn't, but I was never in the military, but people who've been in the military probably recognize paracord as it's the suspension lines for parachutes. It has significant tensile strength. It's woven in such a way that there's nylon fibers in it that strengthens it. And it's very strong, very durable. So what originally was used for the military by the 80s into the 90s, it's becoming more adapted for outdoor, for hunters, for campers, because it has such great strength, tensile strength. And now it even comes in various colors. But this is a white paracord, 550 paracord. There's no paracord anywhere in the house. The parents have never owned this paracord. They've given their credit cards to the police to show that nobody in the family's ever bought this. The duct tape that was tore off or stripped off of JonBenet's mouth by her father, about a 6-inch strip. It's torn on both sides. So for those of us, probably most people listening, you've done something with a duct tape. It's a big roll. When you pull, it's really sticky. It's really hard to work with. for me. But if you can cut it, and it leaves a sharp cut, which has little evidentiary value. But if you tear it, then that leaves kind of a serrated, kind of a torn edge. So if you have the parent roll that came off of, you can match that edge that's torn. Also, on the other end of the strip, that too was torn. So this was torn off of a parent roll of duct tape. It's black, which is kind of unusual at the time. There's various colors, but at the time, there were fewer colors than there are now. But regardless, the parents did not own, they'd never bought black duct tape. The police searched the entire house, top to bottom, and they can't find a roll of that tape. So one of the other theories that Lou talked about, and I mentioned this in the book, is called the transfer theory, that whenever a crime is committed, the suspect either takes something or leaves something at the scene. So what Lou is looking for in his crime scene reconstruction of harmful events is what was left in the crime scene and what was taken away. Well, with the duct tape was left as that 6-inch strip. Someone had to have taken that parent roll away. You can't get that into that house without sticking to everything. So somebody brought that in as well as the paracord. So another really critical piece of physical evidence that comes up at the autopsy is a mark that's below JonBenet's below her ear. And it has a round oval kind of a shape, blackened shape, and then below that is a rectangular red abrasion. But on her back is one real similar to that lower abrasion, and it's right above the kidney on her left side. And these two red rectangular abrasions that Lou thought were heat abrasions from burns are 3.5 centimeters apart. When that's noted at the autopsy, and by the way, the coroner who does the autopsy the next day on the 27th, he does an extraordinary job. He was one of the first medical legal pathologists that Boulder County ever had. In some of the smaller counties, Jim, it's not unusual to have, somebody filling in as the coroner. It might be an RN, or if you're lucky, an RN. Might be a paramedic. Could be a tow truck driver or somebody from the local funeral home. So coroners, at least in Colorado, don't have to be board certified as pathologists. But if you're fortunate enough to have a case where you do have a coroner who's medically certified, like we had in the JonBenet case, you're going to get a much more quality, professional autopsy, and that's what we have here. So he and Detective Tom Trujillo, who was in the autopsy, took some photographs of these two marks in particular. And the mark on the back, Lou will later argue that was done by a stun gun. And he searches every stun gun that was on the market in '96, and he finds one in particular. It's called an air taser stun gun. And it's the type of stun gun that you have a top to it that has two probes that can shoot out. If you take that off, it can also be used where there's two metal probes that it's called a direct contact. So you can touch somebody with that. Now, the way the stun gun works is it immobilizes the muscle between those two probes. So if you do the direct stun to the arm or to a leg, then that part of the body is what's immobilized. So Lou believed that that's what caused the mark to the face and then to the back. And his theory was that she was first stun gunned in her bedroom, which may have prohibited her or kept her from screaming out, because when the stun gun was applied to the throat and the neck area, it may have rendered her unable to scream. He doesn't know for sure, but he did find another case in Colorado of a murder victim that was stun gunned in a similar location, and that person was not able to scream out. So whether or not that was done deliberately or just, accidentally or whatever, but Lou believed that's the first stun gun mark was in the bedroom upstairs when JonBenet's asleep the part of her body that was exposed was her head and neck area. Lou believes the second stun gun mark was in the basement in the boiler room right before she was murdered. Again, they're pre-mortem. The burn marks are not post-mortem. They didn't happen after death. So the reason why that stun gun is so important is when we think of this as what was brought to the crime scene by the killers, what was taken away. Well, you have duct tape, you have the cordage, and you have a stun gun. Well, what do those three things have in common is that's what you would use to immobilize somebody. You're either going to tie them up, you're going to stun gun them, you're going to keep them from screaming, with the duct tape. And that's what your ransom note says. The ransom note says that we have your daughter, you have to pay this ransom if you ever want to see her alive. But for people to dismiss the physical evidence that was brought to the crime scene and to, look at all of that and just dismiss it, or to come up with some alternate theory. And think about this. The DNA that was found on JonBenet's body and on her clothing was underneath her fingernails. The genetic material that contained the DNA is embedded deep under her fingernails. And at the autopsy, the coroner does a really good job of clipping the fingernails and then preserving that, and then that's shipped to the Colorado investigation. And on the left hand and on the right hand of JonBenet, underneath the fingernails, is this genetic material, which would be consistent if she's fighting for her life to breathe. She has a cordage that's wrapped around her throat, and this is fashioned like a garrote to strangle or control her. The DNA that was found underneath the fingernails also matched DNA that was on a blood spot on the crotch of JonBenet's panties. So that DNA matches. It's male. It excludes anybody in the Ramsey family. So if the Ramseys are covering this crime scene to make it look like a kidnap for ransom, other than an accidental death, how and where did they get that foreign DNA? That's never been identified. It's unbelievable that you parents in trying to cover up this accidental death of your little girl could find foreign male DNA that's not in any database that's ever been searched and embed it underneath your daughter's fingernails and smear some on her panties in the crotch area. And then in 2008, the long johns that she was wearing for pajama bottoms, a newer DNA technology was applied on the long johns, and it discovered just below the waistband another area of foreign, unknown male DNA that matched what was on the panties and underneath the fingernails, but did not match any of the Ramsey family. So we have three sources of DNA. And what Lou believed was that, this is absolutely a DNA case. The killer could get rid of the paintbrush and he can get rid of the roll of duct tape. He can, throw away the stun gun, the cordage, the paracord, but he can't get rid of his DNA. And that is what's going to solve this case.
So, John, the authorities go ahead, even though we've sort of picked this apart, there's really no evidence against anyone in the family. The DA proceeds with a grand jury. And of course, Lou at that point is really not happy about all this, is he?
So when the grand jury in Boulder is being impaneled, Lou is seeing that this is going to be a witch hunt. They're only interested in presenting evidence against the Ramsey family. They're not interested in doing any exclusionary evidence. And he says, I need to talk to the grand jury. I need to present this intruder theory. And he's told, no, absolutely not. And in fact, he gets a letter that he kept that was signed by one of the special prosecutors. And for people who watched the Netflix 3-part documentary that was released in November of last year, that Netflix documentary, it's titled Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenet Ramsey? And it was based in part on my book, Lou and JonBenet. And I served as a technical advisor. I was hired as a technical advisor for that 3-part documentary. And I had written the book purposely in 3 parts for a documentary. And so I was hoping the book would be picked up. Radical Media contacted me shortly after the book came out. One of their producers had called, and he said that, so I just read your book, John. This is just like you, Jim. This is a different side of the JonBenet case than we've ever seen. We've ever read this. Didn't know who Lou Smit was, but it's a very compelling case based upon Lou's investigation that there is an intruder, and it's not the Ramsey family. And so the producer said, I got 2 questions for you. One, is the book rights still available? And I said yes. And we negotiated back and forth. They decided not to buy the book rights, but they did hire me as a technical advisor. And since I was being paid as an advisor, they chose not to put me on camera because that would look biased. So one of our other team members, Kurt Pillard, who I mentioned throughout the book, and he was also a friend of Lou Smith's and had talked to Lou about the case many times. So Kurt is the one who appears on film on the Netflix documentary, as does JonBenet's dad and older brother, Burke. Of course, I'm biased, but I really think Radical Media did a wonderful job with that. Joe Behringer, who was the director, he did an extraordinary job. And he even came out afterwards and appeared on several morning shows on TV with John Ramsey, saying this man is probably one of the most vilified men in American history. He and his family suffered, at the hands of the Boulder law enforcement, just unimaginable horror in being accused of a murder of their little girl, which they didn't commit, which was one of the 2 purposes for me writing the book, was to show the evidence clearly suggests that Lou was right with it being an intruder, not a member of the family. But the other thing that Joe Behringer picked up that comes across in the documentary so well is that the DNA can still be used to solve this case. And that's what Lou said. And so for this producer to come out after the documentary and say, we need to keep working this DNA. The DNA is not perfect. The only part of the DNA that we, our Smit family team, has access to is some of the genetic markers. We don't actually have the physical evidence. So to submit the DNA to private labs like 23andMe and some of the others, you have to have access to the original genetic material, which we don't. All we have is just the lab report, the written lab report, but still sufficient to be able to say the DNA is definitely male, probably Caucasian, doesn't match any of the family members. So that's a bit of a start. But there's enough of the DNA that's present off of the 2008 work that was done on the Long Johns that we're told that the DNA is in the CODIS, the Combined DNA Information System that the FBI maintains. Now, that if that's true, and again, our team doesn't have access to the law enforcement databases anymore, and we're not going to ask one of our friends to do something that'd be illegal that's in law enforcement. But we were told that the DNA from the crime scene from her body and the clothing is in DNA, so it is in the database. If that's true, then when a suspect is arrested today on a violent sexual assault or sent to the Department of Corrections, at least in Colorado, a sample of their DNA is usually taken from a buccal swab, which is just a Q-tip that gets inserted in the cheek, between the teeth and the cheek. And once that buccal swab is submitted to the lab, then that's broken down into a DNA genetic markers that information can now be encoded and put into a DNA database. So if a person's already in the database, they can be compared. So what we do is, with what the genetic markers that Lou has left, we've been able to contact people, and sometimes we'll just go up and ask them, your name's been brought up in the case, and almost without exception, there's, I didn't do it, I wish this would go away. And we'll say, well, we can actually help with that, because if we can get, a DNA sample from you, then we can compare it, and we'll be happy to share that with you or whoever, the law enforcement authorities, and that would eliminate you. Now, many times we're told where to go and what to do, and none of it's pleasant. And so, and we don't expect that everybody we contact, is going to, voluntarily give up the DNA sample. Some people just don't want to do that. We have offered money to some people to give that sample, and that's worked with some people. But what we've also done is just surreptitiously obtained their DNA sample, which we've submitted to this private lab that we've paid for. Sometimes it might be off of a straw that they left behind at Starbucks or threw away somewhere.
And also, I think this is fairly recent, the use of familial DNA. Now, you mentioned, Ancestry, those where you can, find family members and whatnot. Familial DNA just recently solved a case I covered for a while called The Boy in the Box, adding a name to a poor young boy who was killed and he was never identified in Philadelphia area. And that case just recently, they didn't solve the case, but they were able to give him a name.
There's been great success with law enforcement using private DNA databases. The Colorado Springs Police Department, for example, where I retired from and Lou retired from, they've solved 4 cold cases doing just that, where they take evidence, sometimes it's 25, 30 years old, and using newer technology, they've been able to submit that evidence and the biological sample, to a private lab, and have gotten into that person's family tree. Now, rarely do you say it's that guy, but what it might tell you is whoever committed this crime is a second cousin or third cousin of someone who lives in Indiana. That's how the Golden State Killer was caught, is the suspect. He wasn't in the database, but his niece, twice removed or something, who lived in another state, she had submitted her DNA like I have. I submitted mine to 23andMe. And so those databases have grown exponentially, and there's samples from all over the world, where the law enforcement databases are much smaller because they have to be a convicted, violent, felon or whoever. So if you can get into that killer's family tree, and as they did with the Golden State case, they said, do you have any male relatives who might live in California? And in that case, she said, well, I have 2, one in Northern California, one in Southern California. The one in Northern California, I don't think it's him, because he used to be a police officer. And of course, that's who it turns out to be. And they end up convicting him of 9 murders. And so the DNA is hugely important, to familial DNA, in solving this case. We've tried to encourage the Boulder police to do that. To what extent they had, we don't know. They quit talking to us. We were able to get to our Smit family team was able to get a meeting with the Boulder DA's office. A couple of detectives from Boulder police showed up. One said nothing. The other one asked one question, asked if we'd share our suspect list or person of interest list. And we said, by all means, we will. And here's the list of the people that we've already eliminated. That first meeting, I think we only had like 9 persons of interest. We asked for a second meeting with the DA. He told us that we'd have to schedule any future meetings with the Boulder Police Department. He told us, go ahead, set up the meeting. I'll try to come if I can. Boulder Police gave us one meeting. It was on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. The DA did come to that meeting. 2 senior members of the Boulder Police were there. Police chief refused to attend, even though it was right down the hall from her office. And so a couple of us from our team met. We gave them our list. By then, we probably had eliminated 13 or 14 persons of interest. We don't call them suspects because they're not suspects until we get a match on the DNA. And if we were, then they go from being a persons of interest to a potential suspect. Again, we have no law enforcement authority. All of us are retired detectives or members of Lou's family that had never been in law enforcement. So that's really a slow process, and we have no legal authority to demand somebody, give us the DNA. When we first started doing this, we just kind of passed the hat, to collect money for the DNA sample, and the Smit family put up, some money to, try to do that too. As we went along, Cindy Smit, Lou's middle daughter, she came up with a brilliant idea to start a GoFundMe account.
That's what I was going to ask. GoFundMe,
yeah,
those are great.
And I'll send you the link, Jim, if you don't mind posting
please.
it.
I got a couple of bucks here. I'd be very happy. No, I'm serious.
Thank you. That would mean a great deal.
And I'll post it on my Facebook. I'll post it all over the place.
I'll be part of it.
But let me just, before we get too far from it, you came close to answering my question. What are the legal rights of the people who donated to 23andMe? In other words, if a private lab, we'll forget about Colorado, if a private lab has DNA sample and they want to submit it because they want to find whatever, what are my rights not to, again, I'm not a criminal, I'm not going to, but what are my rights from 23andMe or from Ancestry?
Yeah.
Can I say you can't cooperate with anyone?
That's correct. Yeah. For those of you that, like me, have filled out and submitted your buccal swab, your DNA voluntarily to someone like 23andMe, when you get the form and you fill it out online, in many cases, you'll look down at the bottom and it says, that you can share this information with others.
Why do you think the DA is reluctant to take that avenue?
Yeah, the Boulder police are the ones who have the evidence.
Yeah, whoever's got the raw material.
Yeah, and hopefully they still have it. If what we were originally told the first couple of times we only met twice. We tried to schedule a third meeting with the Boulder police, and they just wouldn't respond to my email or my phone call. And so I called the police chief and got her voicemail, and again identified who I was, retired sergeant or sheriff. El Paso County, and worked in the JonBenet case. She wouldn't even return my call. So she had the commander in charge of the investigation call, and he said, his purpose for the Smit family team wanting to meet with the Boulder police has to do with Lou Smit's intruder theory. I said, well, yes, of course. That's why we'd want to meet. And he said, well, the Boulder police are no longer interested in meeting with the Smit family team. And that was a couple of years ago, and they've ignored us, so they're not interested in anything outside of something that would point to the Ramsey family. And I think since Patsy's passed on, that they may think in their mind, the person who did this is dead. We can't do this. We've continually submitted updates to the Boulder DA where Lou had originally worked, even though the DA that he originally worked for is long since retired. In fact, the DA that's there now, Michael Doherty, is the fourth DA. And so we continue to update law enforcement in the Boulder area of who we've eliminated if we get a significant lead. I might mention after the Netflix documentary aired, we got several really good leads that we didn't know anything about. And then a couple that we pursued that, I'll give you one example. One example is a young lady who is now like 39 years old, but she was about JonBenet's age at the time of the murder. They lived in Boulder. And I'm not going to mention any names, but what she told our team is that she was watching the documentary and that her mother had told her that her biological father, who they've since been estranged and the mother's divorced, because he had sexually assaulted this little girl, his daughter, when she was little. And he tried to get her to, she was enrolled in some of the beauty pageants that JonBenet was in, and he tried to get her to dress up like JonBenet, and apparently had some infatuation with JonBenet. And then there was some connection. They lived in Boulder at the time, and there was some connection to the dad. And I can't remember what it was, to John Ramsey. Might have been through his business, but regardless, this young lady now, who's called our team, said, "Yeah, my mother has always felt that my biological father was who killed JonBenet," and she says, "I really wondered that too. And oh, by the way, I see that your team is headquartered or kind of located in Colorado Springs. And I'm going to be driving through Colorado Springs next week." And so we made arrangements. She volunteered to come by, meet us, one of our team members who did get a buccals swab. And we submitted it, used some of our GoFundMe account to pay for it. And in fact, we were so convinced that this may be the break that we're looking for, we paid the lab an extra $1,000 or $1,200 to get a rush done on the analysis. It still takes, like 4 weeks to get even a rush back. And so we got that back thinking this is the break that we need, and turned out to be not a match.
Now, John, I can't let you go without an interesting sort of sidelight in the book. It wasn't directly related to the JonBenet Ramsey case, but it does involve Lou. And then just as I'm reading the book, all of a sudden the name comes across, Kelsey Grammer. And so please share with my audience how Lou came to know Kelsey Grammer.
Well, when Lou was a detective with the Colorado Springs Police Department, I was not his partner at the time. I was on the department. I was working patrol uniform services, but it was a very high-profile case. There was a violent abduction of a young girl at a restaurant where she worked as a waitress. She was off that night. She went in to meet a friend when they would get off work, and there were several thugs who were going to rob this restaurant. They abducted her. One of them sat in the car with her, while the other two go in to try to rob the restaurant, a failed armed robbery attempt. And when they come out, they get in the car, said, "Who's she?" And he said, "She's coming with us." And so they abduct her. Her name's Karen Grammer. That's Kelsey's only sister, younger sister. Really tragic, because that was all the family they had, was Kelsey and his sister. The parents had already passed on. And so Karen Grammer's abducted, taken to the apartment that one of these guys had at the time, violently raped multiple times, multiple offenders. And then they promise her, "We're not going to hurt you. We're just going to take you somewhere and drop you off." And on the way to drop her off somewhere, one of the guys ended up stabbing her 42 times, and very brutal, almost decapitated her. And then they throw her out of the car. She was still alive, and she managed to crawl up to a person's house. There was a light on the back porch. This was at night. And so she tries to get their attention. I know I didn't work that case, but Lou had told me about seeing her blood just below the doorbell and running down the window frame. And so she had no identification on her, but somebody put the connection from this restaurant that I wonder if that person that was killed was Karen Grammer. And so they ended up contacting Kelsey, and he flew out to Colorado Springs, met with Lou and the other detectives, went to the coroner's office, made a positive identification on the body was his sister, Karen. And he's just written a book about this loss and the tragedy. So he and Lou stayed in touch throughout the investigation, and she wasn't an isolated case. In fact, Lou put together 4 or 5 murders that these guys were responsible for. Some of them were soldiers at Fort Carson. I was only on one of those cases personally, and very violent murder that I talk about in my book. Lou was the detective who put all of these together and then made the arrests of the suspects that were involved, and to include the guy who had stabbed Karen 42 times, who's still in custody in the Department of Corrections. He comes up for parole in 2030. But Lou and the DA would go to every parole hearing that this guy had, and Kelsey Grammer came to several of the parole hearings, and the parole was denied each time. And Lou did that up until he got so sick he couldn't, do it. And the DA has passed away. So Kelsey is the only one left who can really, testify effectively on those parole hearings. So when Lou passed away, Lou's son, Mark, had reached out to Kelsey through his agent, inviting him to come and give one of the eulogies. I had given a eulogy. JonBenet's father, John Ramsey, gave one, and they wanted Kelsey to be there. But he had some filming with one of the contract with one of the programs that he couldn't get out of, so he wasn't able to accept that. So I've never met Kelsey Grammer. I'd like to. He plays one of my favorite characters on Frasier. So I hope I have an opportunity to do that someday. But Lou had great respect for Kelsey Grammer, and I'm fairly sure that Kelsey Grammer had great respect for Lou as well.
This is a great way to wrap up. So what I want to do, I want you to give us all the information of how people can get you, author site, website, whatever you got, and also very specifically give us the connection. As you said, there's a GoFundMe.
We developed a GoFundMe account, and there are a couple of other ones that aren't associated for us. So ours is, GoFundMe, the family of Lou Smit, searches for justice for JonBenet, and I'll send you, Jim, the link to that so you can post that, because we'd like the money to, if there is a donation, even if it's just $10 or $15, that's wonderful. That helps us if we can get 100, people to do that. So contributing to our GoFundMe account would be very, very helpful. The second thing is just to tell the truth. When people, say, oh, I heard this, or, I think it might be that person. It's like, well, did you know that John and Patsy took polygraphs and passed them? Did you know that DNA cleared the family within 3 weeks of the murder? And that's what also I'll send you, Jim, is the DNA report that Lou had gotten when he worked there, that our team got, that I've released publicly, that I talk in the book. But when you see that 2-page lab report from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and it names, the Ramsey family, and then it shows that they were excluded, it's like, well, why wasn't this ever made known? And that's a great question. Had it named, and identified one of the Ramsey family, that would have been headline news the next day. So we thank you for the time to be on your show, and thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Well, and I want to thank John Anderson, the book Lou and JonBenet, and because it is a marvelous book, both as a memoir for Lou Smit and also for the case that goes on. And so I really do want to thank you, John.
Thank you, Jim. Be well.
So I'd like to thank you, folks, for kindly tuning in for another episode of Murder Most Foul. If you liked what you heard, I hope you'll tell your friends. Information about the podcast and an email link that can get a message to me can be found at the podcast's website, the address being www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces, .com. So, until we meet again, stay safe, and for God's sakes, don't murder anyone.